What is the place of Islam in Europe? How do we make sense of the disputes over the wearing of the hijab, the Muslim veil, in France? Are the Swiss wise to be banning the building of minarets on mosques? Why do some Muslims seem so alienated from the West and from European culture? What needs to change if we're to have a form of Islam which remains true to itself and sits easily within Europe? Joining me to discuss how Islam fits in a European context are Hola Hassan, a writer and speaker on Islam and its attitude towards women's issues and human rights, Dr. Taj Hargi, chairman of the Muslim Educational Centre of Oxford and the Imam of the Oxford Islamic Congregation, and Douglas Murray, director of the Centre for Social Cohesion. Hola, how comfortable do you feel as a Muslim living in Europe?
I feel very comfortable. I've been in Britain since I was a little girl. I was born in Saudi Arabia, but I was here when I was about 9 years old. And I've always been very comfortable with my identity. In fact, when I go back to, for example, Pakistan, where my parents came from, I feel very uncomfortable there. Then I find it really sad that so many British Muslims are still not comfortable and are still searching for their identity.
Taj, there are some who think that a clash between Islam and European values is inevitable.
No, I think that's totally nonsensical. I think if you look at the Quran itself and what Islam represents, there's nothing antithetical to Western values whatsoever. Yes, if we look at the manifestation of Islam by certain extremists, whether it's Al-Qaeda, or Wahhabis or Salafis, that may be a problem. But as far as I'm concerned, when we talk about Quranic Islam as opposed to popular Islam, there's no contradiction whatsoever. There's no incompatibility at all.
Douglas, how comfortable are you with the idea of a European form of Islam?
I look forward to it, and I hope that it's the one that wins, as it were, in this civil war that's currently ongoing and has been for a very long time within the Islamic faith. Europe has very distinctive values, very distinctive identities, and Islam can certainly be and is one of them. I think that what makes a lot of people uneasy is the perceived push within some elements of the Muslim community to tread further into the public space than Europeans are comfortable religion treading.
I want to come to that a little later in the second half of the programme, but first I'd like to examine the historical context in which Muslims arrived in the European continent. And Douglas, one of the issues that exercises some people is the fact that the Islamic presence in Europe did come about through conquest.
Yes, absolutely. Islam in its early years always, of course, advanced through conquest. We have to be accurate about our history, and too many people, particularly in Europe these days, tend to think that if you have distinctive identities, and indeed if you're even truthful about certain uncomfortable historical facts, you're somehow aggravating things in the current day. I'd just give you one example, if I may, which is you quite often hear European politicians talking about the way in which Christianity, Judaism and Islam have all melded together to create the modern European identity. This is true to some extent, but the impression that's always given out is, as it were, the contribution was a third, and a third, which is very much not the case. European civilization is based on a Judeo-Christian identity and its meeting with Greek values.
But nevertheless, for hundreds of years, the Islamic contribution to European culture and civilization was virtually ignored. For example, a lot of Britons, even today, are completely ignorant of the fact that a wonderful civilization existed in Cordoba in the 10th, 11th and 12th centuries, which made huge contributions, Taj, towards mathematics, algebra, even farming, medicine.
Yeah, without the Islamic contribution, there could really be no European Enlightenment or Renaissance. I think Europeans are, on the whole, ignorant about the historical and cultural indebtedness to Islam. I think what's important to remind everyone that Islam has played a valid and very vital role in the progress of Europe, and to deny that, I think, is to rewrite history.
One of the things that one hears many Muslims say about their medieval civilization was that it was very tolerant, much more tolerant, for instance, than Christian, which were towards Jews and Muslims. Do you think that stands up to examination?
I think it does. There's a lot of historical accuracy in that. At a time when Jews and any smaller sects of Christians were being expelled from many European cities, the Spaniard Muslims were welcoming people from all sorts of backgrounds. And one of the reasons, obviously, is that the Quran gives this status to the Jews and the Christians.
People of the book.
Yes, the people of the book, which really helped.
Douglas.
Non-Muslims in Andalusia were not offered equal citizenship by any means. They were prejudiced against as second-class citizens.
I don't think you can call that second-class citizens. It was very much, yes, I know what you're referring to, the Zimmi status.
Yes, they were offered Zimmi status.
But then Muslims had to give zakat, for example, and nobody argues about that. that.
What was the
had to
dhimmi
pay-
status? What was the dhimmi
They had to give a certain tax in return for being protected, but they did not have to pay the zakat, which the Muslims had to pay.
Exactly,
Non-Muslims-
being the almsgiving.
Yeah, the charity which is compulsory.
Non-Muslims,
all
however,
Muslims
did have to
give.
pay a different tax. Non-Muslims had to pay a larger tax called the jizya, and that had to be paid by non-Muslims who also had other things that made them second-class citizens, among other things, for instance, having to turn away in the street if a Muslim came past on the horse and so on.
No, these
a
were
lot of
very
these
rare
things-
examples.
Well,
These were not the norm.
common examples.
These were not the
No,
norm.
but I think what we need to do, Douglas, is that, yes, you can say there are certain indicators where Muslims were treating others as second class, but when Ferdinand and Isabella took over, what did they do? They didn't give Muslims second class status, they gave them conversion or death. It's a very, very important point.
What about what I would term the defining event that has influenced relationships between Christians and Muslims ever since, which are the Crusades, the attempt by Christian armies to regain possession of the holy places in the Holy Land? How important were those events? They formed a huge part of Christian consciousness, Kola. How important are they to Muslims?
Well, that consciousness is still there. It's there in the subconscious of the Western mind, because the Church did very clearly wish to demonize the Muslim faith. So Muslims were portrayed as pagans worshipping a different god. Monkeys were involved in the equation. The Prophet was portrayed as a very, very evil man. The language that was used by the Church about the Muslims was absolutely terrible. And I think that subconscious sort of reaction to Islam and Muslims is still there in the psyche
But to
of
add
the
to that,
West.
I think we ought to make the point that holy war is not just an Islamic invention. Pope Innocent and others all use the same, I think, rather incendiary language.
I think we have to be very, very careful in discussing the Crusades, and not just, as always, to get our history right, but also remember the way in which these events are manipulated currently. What is often done across the so-called Muslim world is to claim, as it were, that violence has only ever historically been carried out by one side, the Crusades being the obvious example. This is to terribly ignore historical fact that from the dawn of Islam, from Muhammad himself, Islam was a violent and conquering religion. That simply cannot be ignored away. Now, that is not to say that is the case. If I may just finish. That is not to say that that is the case now or need be the case now, but it was the case then, just as there were violent and conquering Christians.
For you to talk about violence innate to Islam, it's a distortion of the historical.
From the dawn of Islam.
It's a wrong interpretation. Frankly, if you look at Muhammad, he waged mainly defensive wars. In fact, when Mecca is eventually taken over in the year 630, it is done without any bloodshed.
Yeah, but
Muhammad himself waged aggressive wars.
Let me finish this point.
Muhammad waged aggressive wars. He slaughtered himself whole tribes of Jews, among others.
No, there was a reason for the slaughter of the Jewish tribes, because they had broken treaties that they had signed with the Prophet and with the Muslims. And if you broke the terms of a treaty and you went and actually fought with another group who were fighting the Muslims, of course that's what's going to
This
happen.
isn't exactly a pacifist faith,
But
though.
more
This is the
Nobody
point.
is saying that, but you are
far
distorting
more
history.
important than that is that if you say Islam is violent and there were wars of conquest after the death of the Prophet, what's very important is that even Douglas will have to concede this, that there was no attempt at forced conversions.
No,
there was
nonsense.
no
There was forced
attempt
conversion
at
from
forced conversions. There may have been other incentives provided, but no forced conversions.
Far
Nothing
worse.
on the scale of that.
Repeatedly
You see,
and for many, many centuries, forced conversions, murder of people who would not subject themselves to
That
Islam.
is very inaccurate.
The interesting thing to me about this discussion and the conflicting views we're hearing around this table is the way that history continues to resound right to the present day. Our perceptions of what one side has done to the other still resonate right down to the present age. I want to come to the present age and what has really triggered the present discussion about the place of Islam in Europe. And that is, of course, mass immigration. The experience in different parts of Europe is entirely different. This country attracted people from Southeast Asia. If you went to France, it attracted people from North Africa for colonial reasons. If you went to Germany, it attracted Turks. But it means that different parts of Europe experience Islam in completely different ways, Douglas.
I think there's some truth in that. 3-4 decades ago, the difference between, say, a Pakistani immigrant into Britain and an Indonesian immigrant into The Hague, say, would be very different. I think what you see now in second and third generation Muslims in Europe is a far more common identity, and one which has less to do with the place of their parents' and grandparents' origin.
Do you agree with that, Colin?
I think that's very true, yes. I think there's been a lot of racism from without, which has obviously influenced the whole debate. But the Muslim community has found that at one time they saw an Egyptian as separate to a Malaysian, to a Pakistani. And today they're looking at it saying, no, we all have a common identity, which is the faith, and that the racism which is without, whether it's in France or whether it's in Germany, whether it's in Britain, is united about the same, the dislike of Islam.
Well, let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're discussing the impact of Islam on Europe.